last week, as you may remember, we discussed St. Augustine. And I mentioned that he had a gigantic influence on the just war theory. He's known as the father of the just war theory. This week we are bounding through time straight to St. Thomas Aquinas. Now I recall the first week, I believe Rick asked if we could discuss Crusades, and I said yes. Well, we really don't have time. So what I would like though, because Aquinas comes on board really during the Crusades, maybe a little bit on the tail end of the Crusades, and I'm using Crusades in a very general term, of course, but Aquinas, what's interesting about how Aquinas treats the Crusades is what he doesn't say, not what he does say, and he really doesn't address them at all. However, if anyone wants to talk about the Crusades, mention the Crusades, weave the Crusades into this class, please feel free. I just didn't study it, and I don't really feel like I have enough knowledge to talk about it. But that does not mean it's not open to discussion. Okay.
Certainly an extensive subject.
Right. Yes, that could be a whole Sunday school class. But I'll mention a couple of things about it just because I think it's fascinating that St. Thomas Aquinas comes on board and really does not spend a lot of time discussing the Crusades at all. Okay, a little bit about St. Thomas Aquinas. He lived from 1225 to 1274. If you recall, St. Augustine was the late 300s to about 425. So we just skipped about 1,000 years. But the reason that we do that is because even though the Crusades happened, there is really a period of relative silence regarding the just war doctrine between Augustine and Aquinas. And people who study the just war doctrine today, you don't find a whole lot of, come on ahead, plenty of space. Plenty of space. You don't find a whole lot of heavy thinkers that are constantly quoted between Augustine and Aquinas. So that's why we skip ahead so quickly, other than just having a limited amount of time, 8 weeks for this class. Aquinas was born in southern Italy. He attended the University of Naples and the University of Paris. He studied...
University of Paris at that time?
Yeah, it literally had just been founded, which is actually one of the interesting things about Aquinas' the influences on Aquinas. He studied two main philosophers. Those philosophers were St. Augustine and Aristotle.
That's an interesting combination.
Interesting combination, and it's interesting how he combines the philosophies of these two philosophers in his just war doctrine, which is really sort of what we'll be discussing today. Now, University of Paris had recently come on the scene. I think it was founded in the 1200s, so Aquinas may have been one of his very first students. This was a time, you know, suddenly Aristotle is being studied again. Aristotle at this time was translated into Latin. Universities were starting to spring up in Europe, so there was a little bit of an intellectual renaissance going on, which may explain why Aquinas studied Aristotle and was so influenced by Aristotle as well as St. Augustine. The Crusade era was at its height, and again, as I mentioned earlier, it is interesting that Aquinas does not mention Crusades, but he comes on the scene, he starts writing about just war, he fuses his Aristotelian and his Augustinian knowledge, and he espouses a just war doctrine that essentially doesn't mention the Crusades at all, which I think is quite fascinating. At this time, you know, you may wonder, well, what was the just war doctrine before Aquinas? Basically, the just war doctrine before Aquinas was this idea that a holy war equals a just war. Now, that may sound a little bit familiar, quite familiar, but that's exactly what the Christians at this time were. Both the clergy and the laity, the lay leaders, were pretty much saying at this time. A holy war is a just, of course, a Christian
Well,
holy
if the Pope
war.
is infallible, it goes without question.
Right.
He wasn't infallible then.
No,
Well,
they didn't.
that's a new thing.
1860s.
Yeah, 1879.
Right, fair enough.
Officially.
Right. Thank you. But popes, clergy, and laity were all saying, essentially believing the same thing. A holy war was a just war. A crusade was just by virtue of being a crusade. Now, Augustine, excuse me, I'll probably call him Augustine about half the class, so just correct me, start flagging me if I'm doing it the whole class. Aquinas wrote his main work was what? Does anybody know the main work that Aquinas wrote
Summa Theologica.
the Summa Theologica, right. It was written, it was in 3 parts. It's fascinating how the book is written. One of the things that people said about Aquinas, even in his time, was that he presented his opponent's arguments better than the opponents themselves presented the arguments, which is truly the sign of a great thinker. What he would do is this, for the way that the Summa is set up, and the way that his just word portion is set up, because it's in the Summa, he presents a statement of the problem, namely the opponent's position. He presents the objections to what his response will be. In other words, not just the position, but an explanation of his opponent's position as the opponent would give it, a very fair explanation. He presents the solution that he proposes and his responses to the criticism. So he not only responds to the opponent's position, but he presents his own solution. And this is what he did when he discussed war. Now, he does not discuss war for 48 pages, for an entire volume, anything like that. There's a part with 4 questions, well, really 1 question and 4 articles where he discusses just. Did anybody get? By the way, I sent out a web link. Okay, I sent out a web link last night that presented the part of the Summa where he talks about war most compactly. Now, there are other parts in the Summa where he talks about killing, where he talks about self-defense, where he talks about the nature of the state, and a lot of that is also woven in when we look back on his just war doctrine. And I hope we get to that today, but the primary area where we see his just war doctrine is in this 1 question with these 4 articles. Now, the 4 articles ask 4 questions, and really we'll only talk about 2 of them, because the other 2, I'll put this outline on the website, hopefully it'll be up before Friday or Saturday, and you can see the last 2 questions. But the two questions that are most interesting to the just war doctrine are whether it's lawful, whether it's always sinful to engage in war, and whether it's lawful for clerics and bishops to fight. The other 2 questions, if you got a chance to read it last night, were whether it's lawful to lay ambushes in war, and whether it's lawful to fight on holy days. All right. Those are 2 very interesting questions, but I think there's some things that Aquinas said on those first 2 questions and in other parts of the Summa that are even more fascinating, especially for where we are today. Now, whether it is always sinful to engage in war, question 1. What does that, the way that he phrases that, what does that say about his view of war in general?
Sinful.
It's sometimes sinful.
It may not always be sinful.
Right, right. I think everybody hit it in the perfect order. That was amazing. It's sinful. It's sometimes sinful, but it may not always be sinful. It may, so that there's a presumption that what? That war is sinful. Now, he does not say there is a presumption that war is sinful, but the way that he phrases that question to me suggests that that presumption is there.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Now, again, as we discussed earlier, he phrases the question and he presents his opponent's positions. What do you think when he presents his opponent's positions he goes to first, given what we've talked about in this Sunday school class?
As to whether it is immediately sinful or not sinful.
Right. What have been the arguments in the past the Christian arguments in the past that war is sinful?
You mean what? Text?
Right. In the past,
Source?
right.
From the Bible, obviously.
The Bible.
Beatitudes.
The Beatitudes. The other gospel teachings, some of the teachings of Paul in the New Testament. Right. And that's exactly what Aquinas goes to immediately. The teachings in both the first objection he presents and the second objection he presents when he's given his opponent's position, both of them deal with the Gospels, with the Beatitudes, with the teachings of the New Testament. He goes straight to the heart of the matter, because this is exactly, if you remember from week 2, this is exactly what the church fathers said was the issue with what?
Between love and killing.
Right, between love and killing, between whether or not a Christian can engage in military service, whether or not a Christian can love and kill. And as I mentioned earlier, there never seemed to be a huge issue with warfare in general among the church fathers, because they did pray for the state and they did pray for soldiers.